The sound came before anything else. Not a shout, not a command, not the kind of noise Fort Garrison, Texas had grown accustomed to over 6 years of Colonel Warren Holt's reign. This was sharper, cleaner, the kind of sound that cuts through everything else and leaves a silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat in the aftermath. It was the sound of bone breaking. 282 soldiers were standing in formation on the main drill field that Tuesday afternoon when it happened. The Texas sun sat high and merciless, pressing down on helmets and shoulders like a hand that refused to lift. The air tasted like dust and hot metal. It always did at Fort Garrison. Even in winter, this base carried the flavor of something scorched, something old and stubborn that refused to cool no matter how many seasons passed over it. The soldiers had been mid-maneuver, a standard repositioning drill, nothing unusual on paper. They had been listening to two voices argue at the center of the field, one low and controlled, the other rising towards something dangerous, and they had understood the way soldiers always understand before the officers do that this moment had been building for a long time. Colonel Warren Holt had been walking toward Captain Maya Cole with the purpose of a man who had made a decision. His hand had been rising. And then it stopped. It stopped because she stopped it. In 1 second, one breath, one heartbeat, one blink that none of the 282 soldiers dared to take, Captain Maya Cole intercepted his wrist, mid-motion pivoted, with a precision that looked almost gentle from a distance, and redirected every ounce of his forward momentum back through his own arm. The crack of it rolled across the drill field like a gunshot. Holt dropped to one knee. His mouth opened. No sound came out for 3 full seconds. His face drained of color, the red fury replaced by something gray and unfamiliar. An expression nobody at Fort Garrison had ever seen on Warren Holt's face before. Shock. Plain and undecorated. Maya Cole did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away. She stood where she was, boots planted in the Texas dust, and looked down at the man who had been trying to hit her, and said 4 words in a voice so quiet and so absolute that the soldiers nearest to her would carry it for the rest of their lives. Not now, not ever. Somewhere in the 4th row, Staff Sergeant Darius Webb stood perfectly still. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, built like someone who had spent decades carrying weight which he had in ways that had nothing to do with physical load. He was 58 years old. He had served under 4 colonels at Fort Garrison. He had seen things on this base he had never spoken out loud to another living soul. He closed his eyes, just for a second. When he opened them, something in his expression had shifted, quiet and deep, like a breath held too long finally released. He said something so low that only the soldier beside him could have possibly heard it. 6 years, Webb said. Took 6 years for someone to finally do it. The drill field stayed frozen one moment longer. Then everything moved at once. 48 hours earlier, Fort Garrison had a smell that old-timers described like a hometown. Gun oil and red clay. Diesel from the motor pool. The faint ghost of whatever the mess hall had burned the night before. It was the smell of a working base, a serious place where people had been doing hard and necessary things for longer than most of its current occupants had been alive. Darius Webb had been breathing it for 15 years. He had arrived at 43, coming off a tour in Kuwait and a posting in Germany that had left him standing between 2 versions of himself, uncertain which one to walk forward as. He was not a man who talked about his feelings. He showed up early, did the work, went back to his bunk, and repeated it. That was the version of himself he had built and trusted. Reliable, functional, the kind of equipment that just kept running. He had grown up in Augusta, Georgia, the son of a career Army man who had served in the Cold War era and come home with a straight back, a short vocabulary, and values he passed to his son, not through conversation but through example. You did your job. You respected the chain. You kept your head down when the situation called for it and kept your eyes open always. At Fort Garrison for the first 4 years, those rules had been sufficient. Then Warren Holt arrived. Holt came with credentials that silenced a room before he opened his mouth. Gulf War veteran, 2 commendations for field leadership, a reputation that traveled ahead of him like weather. You heard it coming before you felt it, and by the time you did, it had made itself at home. He was in his late 50s, lean in the way of someone who had never stopped moving, with calculating eyes that rarely blinked and a jaw cut from something harder than ordinary bone. His boots were always clean, even during field drills, even in a dust storm. Webb noticed that early and filed it without knowing why. In the beginning, Holt had looked like order. Formations ran on time, reports filed clean, the discipline that looks from the outside like excellence. But Webb had lived long enough to know the difference between a man who was disciplined and a man who was controlling. Discipline was something you practiced on yourself first. Control was something you practiced on everyone else instead. Holt practiced on everyone else. It started with how he addressed junior officers in briefings, not correcting them exactly, but cutting the ground from under what they were saying before they finished. So the correction happened in advance, leaving them standing before their peers with an incomplete sentence and nowhere to put their hands. It moved to small deprivations that never appeared in any official report supply by request delayed without explanation. Training simulations canceled the morning they were supposed to run, promotion recommendations that went into his inbox and never came out. Nothing you could point to, nothing that left marks. But Webb saw it. He saw it the way you see a crack in a foundation, not because you went looking, but because you had been in enough buildings long enough to know what to watch for. He had kept his mouth shut. That was the truth he carried, the one that sat in his chest like a stone. He told himself it was not his place. He convinced himself the chain of command existed for a reason, that the institution would correct itself in time the way a long river eventually finds its level. He had been wrong, and he had known it for at least 2 of the 6 years he had watched it happen. The night before Maya Cole arrived, Webb sat on the edge of his bunk and opened the small green notebook he kept in his top drawer, the one he had started 18 months ago, when the weight of what he was not saying had become heavier than anything he had ever carried physically. Dates, names, incidents. A lieutenant named Prescott he had watched Holt back against the wall of the ops building in 2021, who had filed for transfer 3 weeks later. The junior officer whose promotion vanished after he refused to sign a report he believed was falsified. The pattern of it, the shape, 22 pages. He read them in the quiet of the barracks, then closed the notebook and lay down with his boots still on, because sleep felt like something that belonged to people with cleaner consciences. In the morning, Captain Maya Cole drove through the main gate in a government vehicle with a duffel bag in the back seat and an expression Webb, watching from across the lot, could not immediately classify. She was not small, not tall either, medium height, compact through the shoulders, with the presence that comes not from size, but from how a person occupies the space around them. She moved like someone who had spent years making decisions in environments where the wrong decision cost more than embarrassment. Her eyes were quick without being nervous, taking in the base layout with the efficient sweep of a person cataloging exits and angles by reflex, not design. 32 years old, 3 combat tours, 1 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. A Purple Heart from an incident she had apparently never discussed in detail with anyone. Commendations for field leadership. A reputation that had not traveled ahead of her the way Holt's had, because that was not her style. Her record spoke in documents and deeds, not advance notices. Webb watched her cross the lot and thought, she has no idea what she is walking into. He was wrong about that, but it would take him time to understand it. The orientation briefing at 0900, 6 officers, Webb in his capacity as senior NCO, attached to command staff review. Holt sat at the head of the table in pressed blues, his expression carrying the boredom that powerful men adopt to communicate that your presence is a courtesy, not a necessity. He looked at Maya Cole once when she entered. One look, quick and dismissive, reducing a person to a category before they had spoken. And then just loud enough for the nearest officers to catch, just deliberate enough to register, he murmured, "Another soft promotion." The room shifted. Not physically. The air changed the way it changes before lightning pressure, dropping before the mind catches up. Maya Cole sat down. She opened the folder in front of her. She did not respond, did not look up, did not adjust her expression by a single degree. But for one fraction of a second, Webb caught it, because he had been watching everything at this base for 6 years and had trained himself to miss nothing. She raised her eyes from the folder and looked directly at Warren Holt. Not a challenge, not a flinch. Something quieter. A measurement. Holt had already looked away. Webb set down his pen and picked it back up. He said nothing, but something had shifted in his own chest, small, barely measurable, like a compass needle finding a new north. The days that followed were an education in restraint. Holt began his campaign against Maya Cole the way he began every campaign, not with direct confrontation, but with the steady erosion of small dignities. He interrupted her during briefings at precise moments when what she was about to say was most likely to land, and redirected with a flat comment that made her previous words sound like noise. "That's a civilian solution, Captain, not a soldier's answer. We'll stick to the standard process. I don't need micromanagement from junior officers. Technically within bounds. Each one left a mark. She absorbed everyone without visible reaction. Took her seat after the interruptions. Maintained professionally neutral expression. kept doing her work with a focus Webb found almost unsettling to watch because he recognized it, the focus of someone making an inventory of not of grievances, but of information. She was not suffering through these moments. She was studying them. Webb found himself watching her more than he intended. There was something in how she moved through the base that reminded him of something he could not name for the first few days, and then one morning watching her cross the motor pool at 0530, when most of the base was still dark, he placed it. She moved like his father had moved, like a man who had been to war and come back, not broken, but altered, quieter, where younger people were loudest, more alert where others relaxed. The walk of someone who had made a permanent peace with the world's danger and its manageability simultaneously. He changed direction and walked toward her. She was reviewing a logistics map on a tablet at the edge of the motor pool in the pre-dawn dark. She did not look up when he approached, but he had the sense she had registered his presence before he reached her. "Staff Sergeant Webb," she said, still looking at the tablet. "Captain." A pause. "You've been here 15 years, she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "And Holt's been here 6. "Yes, ma'am." She looked up. In the gray pre-sunrise light, her eyes were direct, not unfriendly, honest in a way that made small talk feel like a waste of both their mornings. "What do you think of him?" she asked. Webb considered his answer. 15 years of silence on one side of the scale, 22 pages in a green notebook on the other. "I think Fort Garrison has needed a reckoning for a while," he said carefully. She held his gaze a moment longer, then looked back at the tablet. "That's an interesting answer." "It's the honest one." She nodded, the nod of someone filing something rather than responding to it. He walked to his truck. He did not look back. He thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. The first explicit confrontation happened 11 days after Maya's arrival. Holt came into the operations room at 1900 hours alone and closed the door behind him. Webb did not see it. He learned about it later from Maya, told in a flat and factual voice, with no decoration, the way you describe terrain before a mission. Holt had moved through his repertoire, the inappropriate proximity, the words calibrated to land below the threshold of official misconduct, but above the threshold of coincidence. "You have a bad habit of making the men uncomfortable, Captain." She had not responded. He stepped closer. "You think discipline makes you respected. It just makes you difficult." "With respect, sir, I'm here to lead soldiers." Closer still, his breath close enough to be deliberate. "Bold for a woman," he said, and she said, "Permission to leave, sir." The pause that followed lasted several seconds. Something in her stillness, not defiance, not anger, but a completeness of self that communicated she would stand there until the building fell, made him step back. She walked out without waiting for formal dismissal. Outside, the base flag snapped in a night wind. She stood under it for several minutes, not because she was shaken, or not only because of that, but because she needed to understand precisely what had happened and file it correctly before moving on. She did not sleep easily that night. Webb did not either, though he did not know yet they had been lying awake in separate buildings for the same reason. The note appeared on the morning of day 14. Maya found it returning to her quarters after a 0600 Pacific time session, a single sheet of plain paper folded once slid under the door. No envelope, no identifying marks. The handwriting careful, deliberate, the kind people use when trying not to leave a trace of their natural style. "He is watching you closer than the others. You are not the first. Find Lieutenant Renee Ashford." She stood in the doorway and read it twice, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of her PT jacket against her chest. She pulled up personnel records on her laptop. Renee Ashford, Lieutenant Military Intelligence, formerly assigned to Fort Garrison. Clean service history, solid evaluations, reasonable advancement. And then in April of the previous year, a notation so ordinary it would have been invisible if you were not looking for it. Voluntary transfer own request, standard processing. No forwarding base assignment listed in the file. That absence confirmed what Maya already suspected. The record had been managed, not erased, made quiet. She opened a second window and began searching non-personnel channels for contact information on a Lieutenant Renee Ashford, formerly of Fort Garrison, Texas, current location unknown. It would take 4 days. In the meantime, she watched. She watched Holt in the briefings, noting the specific pattern of his interruptions, which officers he targeted, on what topics, and whether the topics had anything to do with competence or everything to do with what competence in the wrong person threatened. She watched how other officers responded to his presence. The slight spinal adjustment, the careful calibration of eye contact, the unconscious performance of deference that had become so habitual. It was no longer conscious. She also watched Webb. She had not made a decision about Webb yet. 15 years was long enough to be compromised without knowing it long enough to have accommodations you no longer recognized as accommodations. She respected his competence and his record. She was not yet sure what else to make of him. On the 18th day, the second twist arrived. Maya had set the trap 3 days earlier. In a small internal briefing with her immediate staff, a group that included Corporal Garrett Finch, 26 years old from rural Oklahoma, who had been on base 8 months and who Maya had until recently found dependable in ordinary ways she had mentioned, as a casual aside, a specific adjustment to the next week's training exercise route. Internal, informal, the kind of details shared in a small staff meeting, and stays there. 2 days later, Holt issued an updated training directive incorporating that change. An exact match. She had given a different version of the same detail to each staff member, varying a specific grid coordinate by a small margin for each person. Holt's directive matched the version she had given to Garrett Finch. She sat with that knowledge a full day before doing anything with it. Finch was 26, ambitious in the way of young people who have not yet learned to distinguish between ambition and opportunity, who see a clear path and take it without asking where it leads. He was not a bad soldier. He was an unformed one. And Holt had found him and made him an offer that probably looked like professional mentorship from the inside. Maya did not confront Finch. She did not report him. She did not reveal that she knew. Instead, she adjusted. The next piece of information she shared with him was also false specific enough to be useful to someone looking to undermine her wrong in ways that would not be immediately obvious. She began being careful about what was said in rooms Finch could access. And she made a decision about Webb. She found him at the motor pool that evening as the sun went down and the Texas sky turned violent orange and deep red like something spilling. He was running a maintenance check on one of the unit vehicles, moving through the checklist with the unhurried precision of someone who did not need to look at his hands. She stood beside the truck without speaking. "You already know," she said. Webb did not look up from the checklist. "About Finch?" "Yes." "How long?" she asked. "I suspected about 3 weeks after you arrived. Another week to be certain." He set down the clipboard and looked at her. "I was waiting to see what you'd do with it." "And well, you're running him as a channel." "Correct." He nodded slowly. "Smart." She leaned against the truck. The last light was catching the dust and turning it gold. She said nothing for a moment, and Webb said nothing either, and the silence was the honest kind. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The woman who transferred out of here about 18 months ago, Lieutenant, Military Intelligence." Webb's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "There was Prescott," he said quietly, "and before her Ashford. I don't know all the specifics. I know she was here. I know she left fast." He stopped. "What?" "I know that I was present on a day I saw something I should have reported, and I didn't." The words came out flat and factual, the way confessions do when they have been rehearsed in private long enough that the emotion has worn smooth, leaving only the shape of the truth. "Why not?" Maya asked. "Because I told myself it wasn't my place." He set the clipboard down. "I've been here 15 years, 4 colonels. I built a habit of believing the system would correct itself if I waited long enough." A pause. "I was wrong about that." Maya looked at him. "The notebook," she said. Webb looked at her sharply. "You've been keeping records, something documented. I can tell by how you describe specific incidents you don't search for the details. They're already organized." Webb was quiet for several seconds. The motor pool was empty around them, the base at dinner. The last slice of sun disappeared below the western fence line. 18 months, he said finally. "Everything I could remember clearly and everything I've witnessed since." "Okay." He looked at her. 22 pages. She nodded once. "Keep it safe. Don't tell anyone else." "Understood." She straightened from the truck, then stopped. "Webb, Captain, I'm going to find Ashford. When I do, I need to know the people I'm counting on are actually committed." Webb looked at her in the near dark. His face was very still, the stillness of a man whose decision had been forming for a long time and had finally arrived at its conclusion. "I've been here 15 years, he said. "I've kept quiet through things I should have spoken about. I'm done with that." She looked at him. "That's the honest answer," she said. "Yes, ma'am, it is." She walked back across the motor pool toward the main barracks. Webb stood with his hands on the roof of the truck, feeling the metal still warm from the day's heat. In his quarters in the top drawer of his bedside stand, the green notebook held 22 pages. He had not known when he started it what he was going to do with it. He was beginning to understand. Renee Ashford picked up on the fourth ring. Maya had found her through a chain of non-official contacts, a former colleague who had stayed in touch with Ashford after her departure, a mutual acquaintance who confirmed she was living as a civilian outside Richmond, Virginia, working in the private sector, and keeping a deliberate distance from anything military. It was a Saturday morning when Maya called using an encrypted line from a channel she trusted. Sitting in her quarters door locked, blinds drawn not because she had confirmed surveillance, but because at this point the assumption of surveillance was sound practice. 4 rings. Then a woman's voice, careful and controlled. "Who is this? Captain Maya Cole, Fort Garrison. I need 5 minutes." Silence long enough that Maya thought the call had dropped. Then, "How did you find this number? Does it matter?" A pause. "No," Renee Ashford said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't." The conversation was brief and devastating the way true things often are. Ashford spoke in a voice organized over many months of private rehearsal. Not cold, but contained the way you learn to speak about something that could undo you if you let it get too large. She had been at Fort Garrison for 11 months. The escalation had taken place over weeks, progressing through the familiar stages, dismissals, inappropriate proximity comments, calibrated below official misconduct, and ended in a single incident in a closed room that Ashford described in 3 sentences without elaboration, in a voice that did not shake only because she had rehearsed it until the shaking was gone. She had filed a complaint, done everything correctly, believed the institution would respond. What happened instead was the offer. An administrative officer appearing in her unit the following week with paperwork already prepared, a voluntary transfer request already filled out, requiring only her signature. In exchange, the complaint would be handled at the command level. Her record would remain clean. She would simply be elsewhere. She had been 29 years old. She had signed it. "I should not have signed it," Ashford said. For the first time, her voice lost some of its evenness. "I know that. I have known it every single day since." "You were trying to survive," Maya said. "Yes, and I did, and he kept doing it to others." A silence. "The note," Maya said. "Someone at Fort Garrison sent me a note directing me to you. Do you know who?" Ashford was quiet for a long moment. "No, but whoever it is, they have been watching this situation longer than either of us." And Maya. A pause. "They have rank, the kind that would have made them a target themselves if they moved directly." Maya sat with that. "I'll find them," she said. "When you do," Ashford said quietly, "tell them I'm ready. Tell them I'm ready to speak." After the call, Maya sat a long time in the silence of her room. She thought about Webb's 22 pages. She thought about General Sandra Huxley, who had visited Fort Garrison 3 months before Maya's arrival on a command inspection, whose eyes, according to Webb's description in one of their motor pool conversations, had swept across this base with the specific attention of someone looking not just at what was present, but at what was being hidden. She did not have confirmation, not yet, but she was building something piece by piece in the right order with enough patience to get it right the first time. She opened her own plain black notebook and added a new page to the section she had titled, in her private shorthand, "Pattern." She wrote 2 lines, "Ashford, Richmond, ready. Source of note, rank, patience, 2 years minimum." She closed the notebook and put it in the pocket closest to her body. 300 yards away, Corporal Garrett Finch was drafting a message to a contact he trusted not to ask too many questions. He had seen Maya Cole on a secure line that morning. He had not heard the conversation. He reported the call anyway. In an office with clean boots by the door and a commendations wall covering the south-facing side, Colonel Warren Holt read the message and set down his coffee. He looked out the window at the empty drill field. He had been here 6 years. He intended to be here 6 more. He picked up his own phone and made a call through no official channel to a contact who understood that certain situations required management before anyone had a chance to get organized. He did not yet understand that what was growing in his command this time was different. Not one officer with a grievance and no one beside her. Something with roots. Something that had been preparing longer than he knew. The week following the phone call with Ashford was the quietest and most dangerous week Maya had spent at Fort Garrison. Holt had shifted methods the way a river shifts when it meets resistance, not reversing, but finding the path of least visibility and moving through it faster than before. Supply requisitions for Maya's unit began disappearing into administrative delay. Not denied. Held in processing limbo with no explanation, the bureaucratic friction that was impossible to trace to a single signature. 2 training simulations canceled the morning they were supposed to run one-line notifications citing resource reallocation. The promotion recommendations she had submitted for 2 of her best corporals came back stamped deferred pending review. No timeline, no criteria, just the stamp and the silence behind it. Webb told her what each of these meant. "He's not punishing you," Webb said one morning at the motor pool. "He's shrinking the ground you're standing on, little piece at a time." Maya looked out across the vehicle bay. A specialist was running a maintenance check 30 yards away, focused on his clipboard. "How long before he moves directly?" Webb thought about it. "He already has. You just haven't seen the next move yet." 3 days after the supply delays began, Holt started bypassing her entirely, appearing in the training yard during her unit's morning PT and addressing her soldiers directly. Not her, them. Technically within his authority as base commander, but in practice always handled through the unit's commanding officer. Twice in 1 week, each time with the casual authority that made it look like a colonel taking interest in his troops, not a colonel deliberately stepping over the officer responsible for them. Her soldiers looked at her each time it happened. She gave them nothing but steadiness, which was the only thing that mattered, not a reaction, not an explanation, just the evidence that she was still there and still in command of herself. On the 9th day of Holt's bureaucratic siege, he ordered a surprise physical stress test for Maya's unit. She received the notice at 700, test to begin at 1100. Full gear, mile runs, push-up sequences, sandbag drills under the noon sun. The timing was not random. The conditions were not random. Everyone paying attention understood what this was. Her soldiers understood it most of all. She met them at the assembly point at 10:50 in full gear, helmet, pack rifle, the same load she expected them to carry. Private Colby Carter, 19, small and quick, from Detroit, it fell into formation and looked at Maya with wide and direct eyes. "You don't have to run with us, Captain," Carter said quietly. Maya looked at her. "You're not running without me." They finished the circuit first, every last one of them. Holt watched from the observation tower, clipboard in his hands, lips tight. Webb watched Holt. Later, Webb described the expression on the colonel's face as he watched Maya's unit cross the finish line ahead of every other group, the particular stillness of a man who had expected a different outcome and was recalibrating. "He's going to move directly," Webb said that evening. "Soon." "I know," Maya said. "Are you ready?" She looked at him across the motor pool in the last of the afternoon light. "I've been ready since I walked through that gate," she said. 3 days after that conversation, Colonel Warren Holt went quiet. No new directives, no unannounced appearances, no supply delays, no canceled simulations, no bureaucratic friction. A full week in which the surface of Fort Garrison returned by every observable measure to something approaching normal. The other officers noticed. Maya noticed them noticing the cautious recalibration, like soldiers coming out of cover, when firing has stopped, but not yet certain it actually has. She did not recalibrate. On the 7th day of the silence, she found a note in her locker, not under her door this time. In the locker itself, which meant someone with access. The handwriting was different from the first note, rushed, written under time pressure. It said only, "He is not done. He is staging something. Watch the drill schedule." She checked the drill schedule for the following week. Full battalion exercise Tuesday. 282 personnel, field formation, live maneuvers. Holt listed as commanding officer present. She looked at that entry for a long time. Then she went to her quarters, sat down, and was very still, the way you get still when something you have been preparing for is finally about to arrive. She thought about Renee Ashford's voice on the phone. She thought about Webb's notebook. She thought about Colby Carter's face in formation, 19 years old, watching her officer to understand what steadiness looked like under pressure. She thought about her father who had told her, "Do the job or don't put on the boots." She had the boots on. Tuesday came the way important days always come, indistinguishable from any other day, the sun rising the same way over the same flat Texas horizon. By 1,282 soldiers were assembled on the main field. The exercise began cleanly. Formations moving, repositioning, the choreography of practice maneuvers running the way good training produces. 40 minutes in, Maya observed a developing gap in the left flank, not catastrophic yet, but a structural vulnerability that in a live scenario would invite pressure in the wrong direction. She evaluated it in several seconds. Standard field protocol was clear. She issued the repositioning command. The movement began. From 30 yards to her left, she heard her name. Not her rank. Her name. Stripped of title, reduced to a label, the way you address someone you want the people around them to hear you dismiss. "Cole." She turned. Holt was walking toward her across the field, and how he moved told her everything before he spoke again. It was not the walk of a commanding officer correcting a field decision. It was the walk of a man who had chosen this place in this audience deliberately, who had been quiet for a week and was done being quiet. 282 soldiers watched. Captain Cole. his voice carried across the formation. Who authorized you to override my formation structure? She kept her voice even. Standard field protocol, sir. I observed a vulnerability in the left flank and took initiative to. That is not your call to make. Still walking toward her, closing the distance. You do not unilaterally restructure a battalion exercise without command authorization. Well, sir, the protocol is clear in situations where a commanding officer is not immediately present at the. Don't lecture me on protocol. He was in front of her now. Close. Closer than protocol allowed. The sun was directly overhead, and there were no shadows, no softening, just the flat, harsh light, and 282 soldiers standing in the silence that soldiers maintain when they are witnessing something they cannot intervene in and cannot look away from. Webb was in the fourth row. He stood perfectly still. He watched. Holt's voice dropped lower, low enough that only the nearest soldiers could catch it, which meant it was not for the record. It was personal. You think you can embarrass me in front of my command captain? She looked at him directly. Her voice was even. Her hands were at her sides. Nothing in her posture offered what he was looking for, not the flinch, not the retreat, not the small adjustment that signals the other person has won. I followed field protocol, sir, she said. You taught it yourself in last month's briefing. Something moved across his face. Later, the soldiers nearest would describe it differently. Some said rage. Some said something colder, something that had been waiting a long time to find a way out. His hand came up. Not slowly, not fast, at the speed of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, who believed in the certainty that 6 years of unchecked authority provides that he could do this and it would land the way he intended, and the people watching would understand what they were supposed to understand. He was wrong about all of that. Maya Cole had spent 3 combat tours learning to read bodies under pressure. She had trained in close quarters defense with an intensity that only makes sense to people who have been in situations where the decision to move or not move, and in which direction was the difference between living and not. And her body had incorporated those lessons below the level of conscious thought, stored them in the part of the nervous system that acts before the mind finishes processing. The moment his shoulder shifted forward, she moved. Her left hand intercepted his wrist in the air before it completed its motion. She pivoted, weight transferring through the ball of her right foot, and stepped through the movement the way she had practiced 10,000 times, pulling his force forward and past her, redirecting it through his own arm, adding her weight to his momentum, until the geometry of it made only one outcome possible. The sound of it crossed the drill field like a rifle crack, sharp and absolute and impossible to misidentify. Holt dropped to one knee. His mouth opened. He made no sound for several seconds. The arm hung at an angle that the human eye registers instinctively as a structural failure. Maya released him and stepped back. Not away, back the precise distance of someone who has done what was necessary and is finished doing it. She stood straight, hands at her. Maya looked down at Warren Holt on one knee in the Texas dust. She said 4 words in a voice so quiet and so complete that the soldiers nearest to her would carry it the rest of their lives. Not now, not ever. 282 soldiers did not move. In the fourth row, Darius Webb closed his eyes. He stood with 15 years of this base behind him and the weight of 22 pages in a notebook he had finally decided to use, and he held that stillness for a long moment. When he opened his eyes, Maya Cole was standing exactly where she had been, not one step back. The medic reached Holt inside 90 seconds. Radio calls went out within 2 minutes. The base machinery shifted into a mode it had not operated in for a long time, the mode for events that cannot be filed under any existing category. Webb moved through the departing formation and crossed the field to where Maya stood. She did not look at him when he reached her. "You all right?" he said. She was quiet a moment. "I didn't want to hurt him," she said. "I know that. I need that on record, somewhere." "It will be. The camera's got every angle." He kept his voice very low. "He made the choice. You answered it." She nodded once. Around them, Fort Garrison continued its recalibration, voices on radios, officers converging, the machinery of a military installation shifting. But at the center of it, where Maya Cole stood, with the Texas sun overhead, there was a stillness that had nothing to do with shock. Something had been building for 6 years. It had just been answered. Holt was carried from the field on a stretcher 30 minutes later. The man who had strode across this base for 6 years as though gravity owed him a special dispensation, lay pale under the afternoon light, and the soldiers who stepped aside to let the stretcher pass did so without the deference they had been displaying for those 6 years. That had already changed. That Webb understood was the one thing that could not be undone, no matter what came next. What came next was Brigadier General Raymond Steele. He arrived from D.C. headquarters 4 hours after the incident with the smooth efficiency of someone sent to contain a situation before it became the kind that could not be contained. He had built his career on being the one who showed up after the storm and made everything look manageable from a distance. He was good at it. He met with General Huxley, met with the legal team, assembled the picture with the specific intent of shaping what it would become. Maya was summoned to the administrative wing at 2000 hours. Webb was waiting outside when she came back out. She stood in the corridor composing the information into something sayable. "They're moving me," she said. Webb absorbed this without visible reaction. "Where? Westfield Command Center. Virginia, effective within 72 hours. She looked at him. "They're calling it a rotation." He was quiet for several seconds. "The formal investigation," he said. "They would use your soldiers as witnesses. All 282 of them. If you're not here, they move me before the investigation is formally structured, before statements can be organized around my presence." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He looked at her. "They're not rotating you," he said. "No," she said. "They're not." The corridor was empty around them. Somewhere in the base a door closed. The flag outside moved in a night wind, carrying the smell of something far away. Maya looked at Webb. "The notebook," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tonight, before anything else moves." He met her eyes. In the low light of the corridor, with the weight of the day on both of them and the weight of what was coming, sitting heavier still, Darius Webb looked like exactly what he was, a man who had waited too long to do the right thing and had finally arrived at the moment where waiting was no longer an option. "Tonight," he said, they moved separately through different routes to the secure channel Maya had identified weeks earlier and kept ready for exactly this contingency. The notebook, the documents, the records of every complaint, every incident, every date and name, everything Webb had been carrying in 22 pages of careful handwriting for 18 months. It went out through channels that had nothing to do with Fort Garrison's internal infrastructure. Addressed to contacts Holtz reached did not extend to attach to a message 2 sentences long that said everything it needed to say. By 0200 it was done. Maya stood in her quarters in the dark boots, still on duffel bag half packed. She was going to Westfield. That was real. There was nothing to be gained from resentment about it. But the records were out. The truth was out. And Renee Ashford, in a small house outside Richmond, Virginia, had said she was ready. Maya looked out the window at the base. The lights were still on in the administrative building. The flag moved in the wind. She thought about Colby Carter, 19 years old, saying thank you not for what she had done to Holt, but for what she had shown them. She thought about Webb's voice in the corridor, steady as anything she had ever heard. She lay down on her bunk and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, her hands were still. Westfield Command Center sat on a low rise in northern Virginia where the land flattened out and the sky came down to meet it almost gently. The complex was modern and deliberately unremarkable from the outside concrete and glass institutional landscaping designed to communicate stability rather than beauty. Inside it ran on the energy of a place where information was the primary currency and the people moving through its corridors had learned to read the space between what was said and what was meant. Maya Cole arrived on a Thursday morning with her duffel bag, her plain black notebook, and the understanding of a person who knew exactly what her presence here represented and had decided to make use of it anyway. The title they gave her was Strategic Operations Liaison, designed to sound substantial while meaning very little in terms of actual operational authority. A holding position, a shelf. The people who designed it believed they were placing a problem in storage, while the institution decided what to do next. What they had not fully accounted for was Major Layla Vance. Vance found Maya on her second day appearing in the doorway of the small assigned office with the directness of someone who did not invest energy in preamble. Compact early 40s, close-cropped hair, with the kind of focused intelligence in her eyes that was either immediately reassuring or immediately unnerving, depending on which side of an argument you were on. She closed the door, sat down without being invited, and slid a manila folder across the desk. "I've been authorized to put together a task force," she said. "Unofficial for now. Internal review of command climate at installations showing unusual patterns of complaint suppression." Maya opened the folder. Fort Garrison was listed first. Below it, 5 more installations, names she recognized, 2 from her own earlier service, one of which she had left earlier than planned for reasons she had never fully articulated to anyone. "You're not here to sit behind a screen," Vance said. "You're here because someone up the chain finally got the message." Maya looked at the list for a long moment. "I'll do it," she said. "I figured," Vance said. What followed was not dramatic the way the drill field had been dramatic. It was the other kind of difficult, administrative, meticulous, unglamorous. Maya worked 16-hour days, pulling files, cross-referencing dates, mapping the timeline of complaints against the timeline of transfers and retirements, and what the records term voluntary separations. She built the picture the way she built field positions in 3 combat tours, carefully in the right order, without shortcuts, because shortcuts in this kind of work had the same consequence they had in the field. The picture that emerged was not surprising to her, but it was damning in the specific way that documented truth is damning harder to argue with than witnessed truth alone. 31 formal complaint records recovered from Fort Garrison spanning 8 years. 11 officially resolved at the command level with no further action recorded. 14 closed with transfer orders attached voluntary on paper and almost certainly not in practice. 6 simply disappeared from the active filing system, recoverable only through archived backups that no one had thought to clean because no one had expected anyone to look. Webb called from Fort Garrison on the 4th day. His voice was the same as always, low and measured with that steadiness that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. "It's different here," he said. "Different how people are standing up straighter." A pause. "Sounds simple, but if you'd been here 6 years to compare it to, you'd understand." She understood without the 6 years. How are the soldiers, Carter made corporal, informal announcement, official paperwork pending, but everyone knows. Another pause. "She's doing well." "Hold the line," Maya said. "Yes, ma'am," Webb said. "Always." The outside world found the story by the end of the first week. Not the full story, the shape of it, the version that travels fastest because it is easiest to tell. A female officer had broken a colonel's arm in front of his entire command. The colonel had a history. The Army was investigating. The reaction split exactly as Maya had known it would. Holt's lawyer issued a statement calling the incident a coordinated attack on the command structure, language carefully calibrated to suggest that what had happened on that drill field was not self-defense, but aggression dressed up as it. Some officers echoed the sentiment privately. On the other side, veterans posted photographs with their rank insignia and a 2-word caption, "Protect others." Journalists called every public affairs number they could find. A senator from the Armed Services Committee sent a formal letter of inquiry to the Department of the Army. Brigadier General Raymond Steele stopped returning certain calls. Then Holt's lawyer held a press conference. He described Captain Maya Cole as psychologically unstable, a disruptive element in an otherwise well-functioning command structure. He used a phrase that he believed would resonate with a certain constituency and that instead functioned like throwing fuel at a fire that had already found the ventilation it needed to become something larger. By the following morning, the number of former service members who had come forward with statements related to Fort Garrison had passed 40. Not all of them were about Holt. Some were about the structure around him, the officers who had looked away, the administrators who had managed the paperwork, the culture that made looking away feel professionally rational. The Army made a decision. Colonel Warren Holt would face a public Article 32 hearing. The notification reached Maya at Westfield on a Tuesday morning. She read it sitting at her desk, the Virginia sky doing something pale and clear outside the east-facing window, the visual equivalent of a held breath. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket closest to her body. When she looked up, Layla Vance was already in the doorway. "Ready for what comes next," Vance said. Maya looked at her. "I was ready," she said the moment I stood up to him. Vance allowed herself a small, precise smile. "Then let's make it official." Fort Myer, Virginia, on a gray November morning, carries the gravity of a place where history has accumulated long enough to become part of the atmosphere. The courtroom designated for the Article 32 hearing was formal oak paneling, dress uniforms, the geometry of authority arranged to make the proceedings feel weighty because they were. It was open to the public. The decision had been made not without institutional reluctance, but with the understanding that a closed hearing for a case this visible would generate a credibility problem larger than the one already in progress. Sketch artists along the back wall, reporters in the gallery, serving officers in dress blues, veterans and retired service members who had traveled significant distances. General Sandra Huxley in the row reserved for senior command staff, straight-backed and still her expression as readable as carved stone. Colonel Warren Holt sat at the defense table in his dress blues chest arranged with the ribbons of a decorated career wrists bandaged. He had recovered the physical composure of a man accustomed to projecting authority, but the room did not bend around him. That particular gravity was gone. He was a man in a chair waiting. Maya Cole entered, and the silence was immediate and complete. She took the stand. She told the truth. Not just the truth of that Tuesday afternoon, not just the raised hand and the intercepted wrist and the sound that crossed the parade ground, but the truth that preceded it. The climate, the pattern, the women who had left, the men who had turned their faces away, the complaint records managed into invisibility, the note under the door, the phone call to Richmond, the 22 pages in a green notebook. Her voice did not shake. It had the quality of something prepared not through rehearsal, but through living through 3 combat tours and 31 days at Fort Garrison, and the long motor pool conversations, and the nights she and Webb had sent everything through a secure channel, and she had lain down with her hands finally still. Colonel Holt did not just abuse his power, she said. He modeled it, taught it, enforced it, and ensured that anyone who challenged it became the next target. She paused. I defended myself because I believed, because I knew that if I did not, what happened to me in that moment would not be the end of it. Not for me, and not for the soldiers watching. She looked at the panel. The threat I neutralized was not foreign, she said. It was standing right here in uniform. The gallery absorbed this in the way a room absorbs something that has landed with enough weight that a moment is needed before anyone can respond. The presiding JAG leaned forward slightly. Holt's lawyer objected. The JAG overruled with a single word and a look that discouraged further objection. Then the prosecutor announced the next witness. The name was not on any publicly circulated list. Lieutenant Renee Ashford walked into the courtroom from the side entrance, dressed in civilian clothes. Dark understated the clothes of someone who had not put on a uniform in 18 months and had chosen not to today, because what she was about to do, she was doing as herself and not as a rank. She was 30 years old. She was steady in the way of someone who has made a decision that required enormous courage and has already passed through the fear of it into the place on the other side where only the decision remains. She sat down, she took her oath, and she spoke. She described 11 months at Fort Garrison in the same contained voice she had used on the phone with Maya. Not cold, but processed the way truth gets processed when you have been alone with it long enough and have finally found the room where it can be spoken aloud. She described the escalation, the room, the offer, the documents she had signed, the morning she had left with her record clean and her sense of herself fundamentally altered in ways she had spent 18 months trying to understand. I signed that paper because I was 29 years old, and I had been told in every way except directly that the institution I had given years of my life to had decided not to protect me. She looked at the panel. I was wrong to believe that was my only option, but I was not wrong about what happened to me, and I am not wrong now. The courtroom sat in the silence of people whose understanding of a story has just shifted beneath them. Holt's lawyer was very still. Holt himself was looking at the table. Then Darius Webb took the stand. He was approaching 60 now, close enough that the number had stopped feeling like a surprise, and he carried the green notebook in his left hand. Not opened, just carried the way you carry something that represents a longer weight than any single document can fully express. He described 2 years of recorded observation, the incidents, the names, the dates, Lieutenant Prescott, and what he had seen in the corridor of the operations building in 2021, and what he had chosen to do with it. His voice throughout was the same voice Maya had heard in the motor pool at 0530 and in the corridor of the administrative wing and in the dark the night they sent the records out. Steady, accountable. I should have spoken sooner, he said. That is on me. Every day of those 2 years, that was on me. But I am speaking now, and what I have to say is documented, witnessed, and true. The notebook sat on the witness stand beside him. Nobody asked him to open it. Nobody needed to. What came next was the moment the courtroom had not been expecting and arriving, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being named in the right room. Colonel Felix Grant, the investigating officer from the Pentagon, stood to address the panel. He had been methodical and largely expressionless throughout the proceedings, the professional habit of someone who understood that the proceedings required objectivity to hold their weight. He presented the results of the forensic analysis of the anonymous note, the paper, the handwriting analysis, the metadata from a document that with sufficient investigation could be traced. He named the source, General Sandra Huxley. The gallery did not explode. It shifted a collective physical recalibration, 200 people adjusting their understanding of a story that had just revealed a dimension none of them had seen coming. Huxley did not change her expression. She sat in the front row of the senior command section with her hands folded in her lap, her back at exactly the angle it had been since she sat down, and she looked at the investigating officer presenting his findings with the equanimity of a person who has known this moment was coming and has been ready for it. Grant described what the investigation had uncovered. 2 years of documentation. A senior officer who had identified the pattern at Fort Garrison during a command inspection and understood with the specific clarity of someone who had navigated this institution for decades that direct action from her position would be neutralized before it could gain traction. An institution that protected certain kinds of power through a reflexive gravity that pulled toward the center every time an outside force tried to apply pressure from a different direction. She had needed someone on the inside, someone with enough experience to be credible enough distance from the existing power structure to move without being anticipated, someone who would not be looking for a fight but would not walk away from one when it arrived. She had found Maya Cole, or rather, and this was the part the gallery felt in their chests, she had made sure Maya Cole could find her way to the truth. Maya looked across the courtroom at General Sandra Huxley. Huxley turned her head and met her eyes. She nodded once, one nod, small, unhurried, containing within it 2 years of patience and calculation, and the particular loneliness of a person who has been carrying a truth they cannot yet speak without cost. No explanation, no apology, no words at all because none were necessary, and both of them understood that. The deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. When the panel returned, the presiding JAG read the verdict into the record. Guilty on all counts, conduct unbecoming and officer abuse of authority, assault, and harassment under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Colonel Warren Holt was stripped of his command, demoted, dishonorably discharged from the United States Army, referred to federal civilian court for prosecution on assault and harassment charges. He left the courtroom without looking at anyone, which was the first honest thing he had done in a long time. Corporal Garrett Finch was not present for the proceedings. He had been transferred to a logistics installation in the Pacific Northwest 2 weeks after the investigation formally opened. His record flagged for a conduct review that would follow him. He was 26 years old, and he had made a calculation that had seemed rational at the time and had turned out to be the kind that defines the rest of a career. He would not be the last young soldier to make that mistake. But at Fort Garrison, at least the conditions that had made it feel like a reasonable bet no longer existed. Brigadier General Raymond Steele, who had arranged Maya's transfer to Westfield with such confident efficiency, became the subject of his own internal review, not for the transfer itself, which had fallen within his authority, but for a pattern of administrative decisions across 3 installations that had once examined with the full weight of the investigative framework now in place a coherent and troubling shape. He declined to comment publicly. The review would take months. Its outcome would add several more pages to the institutional record that Layla Vance's task force was building one installation at a time. General Sandra Huxley remained in her command. She had been cleared of any procedural violation. She submitted her policy recommendations to the Department of the Army the following month. 14 of the 17 were adopted within the year. Maya returned to Fort Garrison 3 weeks after the verdict, not in an official vehicle with a duffel bag and an expression asking nothing of the people watching. She came back in the late afternoon when the Tiersoin light was doing what it does at that hour, going gold and long across the flat ground, making everything it touched look like it had been there forever, and would remain long after the people standing in it were gone. General Sandra Huxley met her at the gate. They stood for a moment before either spoke. "You were right," Huxley said. Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what specifically?" Huxley paused. "About what happens when one soldier stands up." She looked out at the base at the flag moving in the dry, late afternoon wind. "Turns out others follow." They walked together toward the parade field. What Maya found there was not what the administrative language of official recognition ceremonies had prepared her for. 300 soldiers standing in formation, not because they had been ordered to perform a function, but because they had chosen to be present for something they understood. Standing the way soldiers stand when the occasion is real. Not the performed precision of inspection, but something with more weight to it, more intention. Colby Carter was in the 3rd row. She was 20 years old now, wearing the stripe of a corporal on her sleeve. And when Maya appeared at the edge of the field, she straightened to a degree that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the specific kind of respect that cannot be ordered into existence. Darius Webb stood at the end of the senior NCO line. In his dress uniform, which Maya had never seen him in before, and it suited him the way the dress uniforms suit people who have earned every element of what they were wearing. His posture was what it had always been, the straightness of a man who had decided somewhere in the long middle of his life that the weight he carried was going to be carried upright. General Huxley took her position at the front of the field and spoke briefly, not the prepared language of ceremony, but something shorter and more direct. She spoke about what had happened at this installation and what it had exposed and what the Army intended to do with what had been exposed. She spoke about Vance's task force now operating at the official level. She spoke about the new reporting protocols, the external escalation channels, the structural changes now on paper and in process. Then she took the silver oak leaf cluster from the case beside her and pinned it to Maya Cole's uniform. Major Maya Cole. The formation reacted the way formations rarely do not, with the clipped precision of a commanded response, but with the sound of people who have been holding something and have been given permission to release it. Not chaos, something more controlled than that, genuinely felt, which was rarer and more valuable. Colby Carter pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance and lost the battle she had been fighting with her own composure and let the tears come without wiping them, because she had decided somewhere in the last several weeks that there were things worth letting show, and this was one of them. Darius Webb raised his hand in a salute that was precise and slow and fully intentional, the salute that means exactly what it is supposed to mean and nothing less. His face above the salute was the face of a man who has done something right after a long time of doing the easier thing and who knows the difference and is not pretending otherwise. Maya returned the salute. She held it a moment longer than protocol required. He nodded once, just once. She turned back to face the formation. 18 months later, a morning briefing at Fort Garrison ran 47 minutes without a single interruption. This would not have seemed remarkable to anyone who had not been present for the 6 years before it. To those who had, it was the kind of thing you felt in your body before your mind finished registering it, a quality of air in a room where people were speaking and being heard, where junior officers presented assessments without adjusting the content based on who was sitting at the head of the table. Colby Carter stood at the front of the room and delivered a logistics analysis to the assembled command staff. 20 years old, 2 stripes on her sleeve, speaking with the even directness of someone who has learned from close observation of a specific example that clarity is a form of respect, and you offer it without apology. Nobody interrupted her. She finished, answered 2 questions, and returned to her seat. In the motor pool after the briefing, Darius Webb sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold the way his coffee always went cold, because he never remembered to drink it while he was thinking. He was looking out at the training field, where a group of young soldiers ran an early drill in the gray morning light. He had put in his retirement papers 2 weeks earlier. Not because he was done, he would never be entirely done, but because he had understood in the way you understand things that have been true for a while and have finally reached the surface that the work he had set out to complete here was finished. The task force Vance was running had expanded to 12 installations. The new reporting protocols were in place. The archive complaints had been reviewed, and the cases that could be acted upon were being acted upon. The people responsible for managing them into invisibility were being held accountable in ways the institution had not previously managed. He had done his part. He had done it late. He knew that. He would always know it, the way you always know the things you got wrong, even after you have done something right. But he had done it. He thought about Maya Cole sitting across a plain desk at Westfield, signing her name to the bottom of a policy document that would restructure the complaint escalation channels for military installations across the Eastern Command. A document that would live in filing systems and procedural manuals and would rarely be cited by name. But that would change in concrete and specific ways what happened to the next person who needed the institution to protect them and found the courage to ask it to. He thought about Renee Ashford, who had gone back to Richmond after the hearing and called Maya 3 weeks later to say she was just considering, whether there was a version of public service she might return to one day. Not the military, something else. Something where what had happened to her was not a wound she was required to hide, but experience she was permitted to use. He thought about his green notebook donated to the investigative record, existing now in the permanent files of the Article 32 proceedings documentation of what sustained attention and moral clarity look like when a person finally decides to apply both. He thought about Maya Cole's voice in the motor pool in the dark. I need to know the people I am counting on are actually committed. He had told her he was done keeping quiet. He had been. He set down the cold coffee. Outside, the young soldiers finished their drill circuit and regrouped at the far end of the field. One of them, small, quick from somewhere he did not know yet, called out something to the others, and the group laughed, the loose and genuine laugh of people who are tired and not unhappy about it. Webb stood up from the field stool. He had a full day ahead of him. Retirement paperwork, a final evaluation, a conversation with the incoming command staff about the documentation protocols that would outlast his presence here. The ordinary work, the kind that builds things quietly without drama, in the time after the dramatic thing has happened and the story has moved on and the real construction is just beginning. He walked back toward the administrative building, and he thought as he walked about what it costs to finally say what you have been not saying and what it costs to stay silent and which of those two costs you can live with. He had learned the answer to that later than he should have. But he had learned it at Westfield in an office with a window facing east. Major Maya Cole was already at her desk. She had been there since 0600. She would be there until the work was done, which was the only schedule she had ever operated on. On the corner of her desk, beside the policy documents, in the task force reports, in the correspondence that accumulated in the work of changing something structural and resistant and accustomed to its own weight, sat a plain black notebook. She opened it occasionally not to read what was inside, but to remember what it had felt like to write each entry, the early ones careful and methodical, building the picture piece by piece in the dark of her Fort Garrison quarters. The Richmond entry, the pattern section, and the 2 words she had written on the last night in Texas with her boots still on, and the whole base settling into quiet around her, carrying the full weight of what she had committed to, and every person it was made for. Never again. She had meant it as a private promise, a thing said to herself in the dark. It had become something larger. She had not sought that, but she was not going to set it down. She picked up her pen. She turned to a new page, and she got back to work.